have ground truth, unless you have a sample, unless you find libraries protected deep inside that have not been affected by the exterior meteor strikes, it's very difficult to judge looking at these photographs for most people whether you're looking at something natural or artificial. Well, over the last 30 years, using Carl's dictum about geometry, we have, created a mechanism, a modality, a procedure that allows us to detect the artificial stuff, even if it's in an incredibly ancient, battered, and not very well-preserved condition. And that's, in fact, what we seem to be seeing at Phobos.
The reason why I asked that, of course, is also connected with the idea that, for instance, people like Jim Marrs writes about in Alien Agenda when he brings up the moon, our moon, that also actually is hollow, and some suggest that this might be a constructed, object.
Not exactly.
No?
Well, Jim is not a scientist. Jim is a really, really good, journalist. Jim and I are friends and colleagues. And in fact, at one point we were actually even discussing doing a book together. Jim is relying on reports from other experts in this arena, which again I think has been deliberately muddied. The data has been contaminated politically to keep people from really realizing the truth. It's not that our moon is hollow, the Earth's moon. Where that came from was during the Apollo mission, when various rocket stages were impacted on the moon, both deliberately and inadvertently. The seismographs that the astronauts planted on the moon mysteriously rang for hours, and they don't do that here on Earth. And so some wag, compared it to the ringing of a bell and leaped to the conclusion that the moon had to be hollow. No, all the moon has to have on its surface is a lot of ancient structure, like trestles, like skyscrapers. And when you hit the moon with the equivalent of 11 tons of TNT, which is what these, impacting rocket stages delivered to the moon in terms of energy, when you look at the energy signatures on the seismographs of that impact, what you're seeing in the seismic signals in the analysis is indications of the vibration of a lot of artificial stuff on the surface of the moon that makes it appear to the uninitiated, to those who don't know how to interpret this data, that the moon in fact is hollow. Because when they hear ringing, their metaphor in their minds is bells, which in order to ring have to be hollow. No, the moon is not hollow. The moon has a lot of junk on the surface that rings like a bell when you hit it, with some kind of energy signature, like an impact or TNT. But in fact, the moon is not hollow. The moon is a natural object on which a lot of artificial stuff has been built. Now, the moon is 2,160 miles in diameter. Phobos, the inner moon of Mars, is not even 15 miles in diameter. It's the size of a tiny, village here in the United States. I used to live in a little place called Berkeley, California, just across the bay from San Francisco. Berkeley is about 15 miles across. It's a small, small, small city. Phobos is an artificial object the size of a tiny American city, whereas the moon is a celestial object on which artificial things have been built, and the political surround has been very carefully muddied up and confused to keep its reality and with the structures on its surface a secret for as long as possible. So I would not confuse the two.
You also write in the article about Phobos here that it's one that appears to have literally been through the wars. Have there been a war in heaven, Richard?
Well, that brings up a very interesting set of speculations, and my colleague and friend Dr. Joseph Farrell has delved into these, and I would certainly recommend that you interview him.
We've had him on a couple of times, yes.
Okay, well, you know that Dr. Farrell, who has a PhD from Oxford in England, and a background in religious history and religious dogma, which is called patristics, starting with ancient sacred texts, arrived completely separate from our investigation at the conclusion that there were indicators in our ancient cultures, ancient texts, of some kind of extraordinary cosmic war, a literal, shoot 'em up war in the ancient solar system. And our evidence, independent of Joseph's, indicates that war probably, in fact, took place. So when I made the comment in the Phobos papers regarding the fact that Phobos appears to have been through the wars, I was being slightly tongue-in-cheek in that I think that a lot of the surface damage that we see on Phobos and on other objects in the solar system that we have also carefully investigated over the last 30 or so years as new data comes in from NASA and ESA and the Russian missions and all that, I believe we're looking at the evidence of an ancient cosmic war that Joseph has only been able to approach through text, and we are now able to approach through actual data of the state of the real solar system and the objects that are in it that are not exactly natural.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I don't know how much time you have, to look at sci-fi, as it were, but some of these even could be, this type of information could be leaked out through the entertainment industry as well. If we look at a television series like Battlestar Galactica,
Heinrich, funny you should say that, because that's exactly what the Brookings Report recommended.
Right.
That there be a concerted political effort at the level of media, television, film, radio, newspapers, etc., and fiction that would prepare people for the reality of their own history. And I think that's exactly what we've been seeing in various television series and various films, like Star Wars. I mean, come on, Star Wars, if you really step aside, could in fact be a slightly metaphorically, fictionalized version based on the data we've now been acquiring of our own history. And I think when all is said and done, and we ultimately all know in maybe a couple of years, that's going to turn out to be the truth. Well, that would be extraordinary, because it means then that the producers and directors and writers like George Lucas and my old friend Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, for which I named the Enterprise mission, because that's the mission that we're on, to basically reveal that Star Trek is not fiction, it's a reality. That all would come to a head if, in fact, the Brookings Report has been followed, and all of this cultural and media preparation in the form of fictional scenarios. You mentioned Battlestar Galactica. Well, Battlestar Galactica basically said it, didn't it?
Yeah.
In its last episode of its final season,
sure
it
did.
basically said that the human race came from an amalgam of ancient ancestors from beyond the solar system in this solar system who left what we now see. So that, to me, is more of the drip, drip, drip.
When the Russian launched those two unmanned satellite probes that you mentioned before, Phobos 1, Phobos 2, and one, I can't remember now if you said both were disappeared, were taken down, so to speak, in one way. Is this because, if this is a ship out there that we're talking about, could this be some kind of automatic defense thing, on the ship that actually took them out because they came too close? What do you think happened?
Well, okay, that's an interesting speculation. I don't happen to buy it. I think it has a much more mundane explanation. I think when the Russians sent their Phobos mission, they were in the same position that we are and most of the people in the audience are, which is, oh my God, wouldn't it be incredible if this was true? But of course, we don't really think it's true. Then they got to Phobos with Phobos 2, and they found that it's true. So what did they have to do? They had to kill the mission publicly if they were going to keep the secret privately. So how do they do that? Well, they started spreading weird rumors that nobody in the mainstream press would ever in a million years believe by sending even astronauts. I believe it was Marina Popovich, who was one of the Russian cosmonauts, married to another cosmonaut who made trips around the world to various meetings, UFO, conferences and whatever, where she basically extolled the idea, holding up some photographs, that the Russian, Soviet Phobos 2 mission had been shot down by some kind of alien spacecraft. Well, what better way, Heinrich, to keep the secret? Because as soon as she attached that idea to the Russian mission, nobody at NBC, CBS, ABC, the BBC, Swedish National Radio or Television, nobody for an instant would entertain in the mainstream that was in fact what had gone on. So it becomes, as Marshall McLuhan said very aptly many years ago, the best secrets don't need